Okay, let's continue our discussion. So in the first half of today's lecture, so we just learned how we derive this aggregate demand curve, right? And we also learned the factors can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift, right? And then so we have some interesting discussion regarding to fiscal policy and monetary policy. I want to warn you, so the discussion on fiscal policy and monetary policy is quite complicated. If you haven't able to understand those, don't worry, because we have an entire new module is waiting for you to understand. But certainly, this is something very relevant to us, and particularly in this interesting time, right? All right, so now let's just look at a few more slides before we can move to aggregate demand. Oh, by the way, here, so the curve shift to the right is called increase, right? And the way we understand that is, so given the level of price, so you can see the aggregate demand increase from this dot to this dot. On the other hand, if the aggregate demand shifts to the left, we call this is a decrease in demand, right? Okay. So, right, so this slide just emphasizes a movement along versus a shift of the aggregate demand, right? So here's the questions. Does a change in wealth move us along the curve or shift it, right? So actually, it depending on what caused the wealth change, right? So if it is a change in price level, that's the only reason cause your wealth to change, and then so we are going to see a movement along the aggregate demand. So example, rapid inflation will shrink our wealth. So that's going to push us down the aggregate demand curve. And actually right now, so there's a fear about reflation. So if you read newspaper, it's called reflation. And why this is called reflation is actually, this means the coming back of inflation. Because in the US, so we have experienced a historical low level of inflation for quite some time, okay? And now, so we are worried about the inflation will coming back. And where does this worry coming from? It's largely because the government has carried out several rounds of massive stimulus plan, right? And so this massive stimulus plan, so at the minimum, will increase aggregate demand. If the aggregate demand did increase, so that just means there are more money going after for the goods and the service we can produce. And then naturally, so the price level will increase. So that's why, so there's a discussion about reflation. Okay, but that's the cause of the reflation. But then, so in the newspaper, if you had a chance to read those newspaper, so the reflation is going to have a lot of complicated impact on our economy. So for example, so this reflation will have tremendous amount of impact on the stock market. If some of you indeed invest in stocks, so for example, those high-rise stocks like a Tesla or Zoom or I don't know, Airbnb, okay? And you probably experience a loss of your investing. And that has a lot to do with this reflation. It's because the reflation eventually is going to lead to the interest rate to rise, okay? And the interest rise is going to lead to a bigger discount for those stocks in terms of their future revenue. That's going to translate into a lower stock price, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop here for those discussion because that certainly just go beyond to our class of macroeconomics. To finish this slide, so if there's a change in something else that affect our wealth, say for example, the tax policy, okay? Say for example, the technology, change our expectation of economic growth, and then the curve will shift, right? Okay. Now let's look at two practice questions, or one maybe. Okay, if the economy is in equilibrium and the real estate market collapse, what will likely happen? Okay, so this is going to lead the aggregate demand to fall, because the crash in the housing market is going to reduce our wealth, right? But remember, so the discussion we just had in previous slides. So the change in wealth is some factor different from the aggregate price, right? So hence the aggregate demand curve shift to left. Okay. Now, if we look at actual economy, okay, so you may be wondering how we can distinguish between the shift of aggregate curve and the movement along the curve. Okay, sometimes it's hard, or usually it is hard, but except in 1979. So what happened in that year? So there's a high inflation of 15%. Okay, for an advanced economy like the US, this is very unusual. But for an emerging country or a poor or a developed country, so this probably is quite common, but not for US. Okay? And this year, so the price level rose significantly. Consumer investment spending drops. Okay? And so if we look at aggregate demand curve, okay, so if the price rise, okay, and then so that just means the spending, the aggregate demand will fall, right? So in this year, so what caused this phenomenon? This is because there is a leftward shift in the short run aggregate supply, okay, and that just push us to the left side, or so which push us to move along the aggregate demand curve. All right. So we may coming back this example later. So once we studied the aggregate supply. Okay. Now we are moving to the second part of this chapter. Okay, so we are going to look at aggregate supply. But the way we look at aggregate supply, we are going to separate between short run versus long run. For now, we're going to start with short run. Okay. So this is how the aggregate supply curve will look like in short run. Okay. In macroeconomics, short run usually refers to a time period less than a few months, okay? Or maybe it's like a few weeks. All right, so this is how you understand. But later we have more subtle difference that differentiate between differentiate between short run versus long run. For now, let's just think about short run as for a few months, right? So the aggregate supply curve shows the relationship between aggregate supply. Okay, so that's also real GDP, that's just what we produced versus aggregate price level. All right, and here, so we put a particular year in this diagram. So this is 1929 and versus 1933. Right. So you can see from 1929 versus 1933, so the price level decline, the GDP shrink. Okay. So essentially we are in a deep recession. Okay. But now we need to understand why the aggregate supply curve is a downward slope. meaning the lower the price, okay, lower the price, the lower the GDP. Higher the price, higher the GDP. So we need to understand what is behind this downward slope of aggregate supply. Okay, so the answer largely coming from a particular feature of our nominal wage. Okay, but first of all, what is nominal wage? Nominal wage is a dollar amount of the wage paid by the employer to employee. Right? So for example, so so give me some amount every year, right? Or if you work for a local restaurant, so the restaurant will give you a contract. The contract specify how much they are going to pay you for each hour you worked, right? And maybe include some bonus, but everything is in terms of a dollar. I just give you an example, what is real wage? Okay. A extreme case can be, so in real wage, meaning if you work for a restaurant, and a real wage, an extreme example of real wage can be the restaurant just tell you for each hour you work, so they are going to give you certain amount of bread. Okay, what is the difference? The difference is nominal wage give you dollar. Okay, and then the value of your nominal wage will change depending on the aggregate price level. On the other hand, real wage, like an example I just give to you. Okay, so what you actually get out of your work won't change with aggregate price. Once your employers agree to pay you, say for example, 2 loaves of bread per hour. So regardless what is the price level, so you always receive 2 loaves of bread. Okay, but the nominal wage will adjust depending on the price level. I mean, it's the value of nominal wage. Okay, so and then this nominal wage has a particular feature. In reality, it's called sticky wage. And what is sticky wage, or what does sticky wage means? It means nominal wage usually are slow to fall, or in general, is difficult to adjust, right? And it's slow to fall even in the face of high unemployment, and slow to rise even in the face of labor shortage. But in either case, just means so the nominal wage is not easy to adjust. Usually, if there's high unemployment, okay, if the wage, more specifically, if the nominal wage is flexible to adjust, okay, in that case, the nominal wage should fall. Why is that? It's because there are many people lost their job, many people looking for a job. And then the employer can reduce the wage, or the worker willing to work for a lower wage. So this is in the case if the wage can flexibly adjust. But in reality, so even though we are in a recession, even though there's high unemployment, the wage may not fall as it should be. So this is called sticky wage. Okay. So then this sticky wage has a very important impact on the aggregate supply. Okay. To understand that, let me just give you an example to understand the implication of this sticky wage. Right. Just imagine, so you work for a local restaurant. Okay. Let's say, for example, you work for Five Guys. Okay, let's just simplify. And so if you work for that restaurant, usually, so you have a contract, either it's a verbal contract or is a written contract with your employer or with your manager, whoever hires you. So usually the contract says the store or whoever you work for will pay you a certain amount. Okay, let's just simplify, say, so they agree is going to pay you $10 per hour. So this is example of nominal wage. Okay, so in reality, not only they specify your wage rate, and usually the contract says, so this is good for certain time period, right? I guess usually, so the contract is for at least 6 months, right? And in some case can be 1 year or maybe 3 years. And the contract says, so this wage will stay there for the time period the contract specified. Okay, so I guess this is a usual situation. Now, to help you understand the sticky wage, say, for example, the burger costs you $10. Okay, at the time when you decide to work for the business. So that just means for each hour you work, you are going to get $10. With this $10, so essentially you can buy 1 burger. So that's a real value of your wage. Okay, so this is step number 2. Now, step number 3, just imagine there's a change in aggregate price. To simplify, say the burger becomes $20 per $20 each. So now what that means? First, look at what that means to you. Because you have a fixed contract, right? And that just means, okay, you still make $10 per hour. Now for that hours of work, you get paid with $10. But these $10 only give you 1/2 burgers. That's what that means to you. Okay. Now let's see what that means to your manager or the business owner. The business owner, so they pay you $10, right? So that's the cost you guys agree, or that's the wage you guys agreed, right? And so in that sense, the cost of hiring is the same. But this business owner or manager, they are going to make more profit by hiring you. Why? Because the burger is going to generate more revenue, right? So now what that means in the short run, because of this sticky wage, in a sense, so you cannot ask for pay rise. And so that means the business becomes more profitable. Right? Business becomes more profitable. So that's going to give the business incentive to expand by hiring more. So then, so naturally, that should lead to the GDP to increase, because every business is going to do the same things. Every business faces the same issue, right? Because aggregate price increase their revenue. Okay, but the sticky wage will hold on the changing costs. All right. So in that sense, in the short run, the price increase leads to output increase. Okay. Now the next slides will summarize what I just discussed. Okay. If you think about business, the profit per unit. Okay. Think about it here, the per unit is per worker hour. So equal to price per unit. Okay. So that just means so the price of the goods and the service a worker can produce in 1 hour. Now minus production cost of per unit. And the example given to you that includes the cost of hiring 1 hour. So the business must pay $10 to the workers. And also includes the ingredients to make the burger, right? Or maybe also includes the rental costs, and maybe includes the gas, electricity, so on and so forth. So now nominal wage are often determined by contract, and the contract are fixed for a certain time, right? Now when the aggregate price increase, so this term is going to increase. In terms of production, the ingredient will increase, but the hiring cost will stay put. Now you can do the simple algebra, you can see, so that just means the profit per unit will increase. So that is why the higher aggregate price leads to higher aggregate supply. It's because the higher aggregate price leads to a higher profit per unit. And this higher profit per unit largely coming from the fixed or sticky hiring costs, right? Okay, so this is the reason behind why the aggregate price why the aggregate supply curve is upward slope. Okay, let me see, there's a question from the students ask me, so when aggregate price level increase in the short run, the business usually won't raise wage or hire more worker. So now let's go back to the previous slides, kind of summarize or kind of answer your question. Okay, so the price increase in the short run, the business has the luxury to not raise your wage. Why is that? It's because there's a contract here says, so I will pay you a certain amount for a certain time period, right? So either 6 months or 1 year, meaning in the following 6 months or following 1 year, even though there's a high inflation, so we agree. That means when I say we, means the employer and the employee. So we agree. So I only pay you this amount of dollars for each hour you work. So this is number one. But actually, so these fixed contract will help the business generate more revenue or more profit, to be precise, if the wage is fixed and when the price level increase. So actually that is going to give the business incentive to hire more worker, right? Because for each worker hours they hire, they can generate more profit, right? Now you may be wondering what will happen in the long run, meaning after a few months or even longer. So you may ask yourself the question, if you are this individual who get paid for $10 per hour by flipping burger for Five Guys. Now you are experiencing, or we are experiencing, a high inflation. Burger becomes $20 per hour. Before the price change, for each hour you work, you can buy yourself one burger. Now you have worked 2 hours to get one burger. As time passes by, what do you think? What are you going to do? Are you going to suck it up, or you are going to do something? I guess most of us won't let it go, right? So I guess you have two options. Option number one, you go to your manager's office, says, so this is not fair. So before I work for you for 1 hour, I get one burger. Now I have worked 2 hours to get one burger. You make a lot of profit, but I'm suffering. Okay. So if you don't raise my wage, I'm going to walk away. So probably this first is you're going to do, right? And alternatively, so you may just looking for other jobs, to looking for other stores who's willing to, or who's able to pay you for higher wage, right? So in either case, that just means over time, there's a force that's going to make the wage to adjust, right? What that means is, so your employer, or pretty much every employer or any business owner, must adjust the wage to reflect the aggregate price change. Otherwise, they are going to lose their employees, or they are going to make their employees unhappy. They start to come late, or start to become less productive, right? So that's how things are going to adjust. And then, so basically, I just explained to you over time. So this sticky wage becomes non-sticky. Or over time, you're going to see the wage is going to adjust. Or furthermore, if you're visiting furthermore, that just means over time. So this relationship we observe in the short term between aggregate price and aggregate supply will disappear. Because over time, let's go to the next slide. Over time, so this extra profit, the business owner can make through this sticky wage, so these are linked to each other, will disappear, right? In the short term, the business owner can benefit from price increase, okay? Because the price increase, they can generate additional profit per unit from sticky wage, as in this link, in the short run. But over time, the workers will find solution to fight back, meaning over time. So these hiring costs must increase to reflect a change in price. Or in other words, over time, or in the longer term. So this increase in profit will disappear, because both ingredients and hiring costs will increase. It's going to offset the increase in price per unit, or the revenue, right? Or in other words, in the over time, or in the longer term, the relationship between aggregate price and aggregate supply we observe in the short run will disappear. Okay, but for now, let's just focus on short run. So I just explained to you in the short run what will happen. In the short run, to summarize, higher price leads to higher output. And why is that? It's because higher price is going to increase the revenue for business. but the cost stay the same, particularly the cost of hiring. So that leads to higher profit. And that leads to their incentive to expand or incentive to hiring more. So that leads to the increase in aggregate supply. All right. Okay, so for today, so I'm going to stop here. And then next class, which is Thursday, so we will continue our discussion, finish the aggregate supply, and then so we are ready to see how the price and the aggregate output will determine in the equilibrium model. Thank you so much for your attention.